We have a lot to cover today, so we want to go ahead and dive right in. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on dismantling inequities in the Nashville youth experience. My name is Katie Kaur. I am the president and CEO of the Nashville Public Education Foundation, and we are thrilled to be co-hosting this conversation with our colleagues at Vanderbilt's Peabody College. I also want to give a shout out to our wonderful partner, AllianceBernstein. AB has been a sponsor of much of NPEF's advocacy work around inequity, and we really appreciate their leadership and investment in these conversations. So we have a lot to accomplish today. As we know that schools are beginning to make the plans to reopen in the fall and reimagine what learning is going to look like in the fall, we also are grappling as a nation once again with systemic racism and inequity in all sectors of our lives. And we at the Public Education Foundation really find it to be incredibly important at this time to use this moment to deepen our understanding of inequity in public education, to have very open and honest conversations around how racism and race play out in our public schools, and to really learn and hear from those who have been focused on issues of inequity their whole lives, some of whom you will be hearing from today on today's call. So today we're going to have the opportunity to learn first from Dr. Maury Nation. I'll give him a little bio intro in just a few minutes, and then after we have a little bit of a session of his findings and his early research, we are going to shift over and hear from a set of experts in working with youth every day in our community. Before we get into the meat of the conversation today, and we're thrilled to have over 250 people RSVP'd for this event, and we're also live streaming it on Facebook at this time as well. I want to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. We really are wanting this to be a conversation as much as possible around inequity with 250 plus people. And the way that we can do that most effectively is by using the Zoom chat feature. And so we encourage you throughout the discussion to ask questions in the chat feature. You can just select to all panelists or all panelists and attendees and just ask your question. We will be making notes of those questions throughout the presentation. Dr. Nation will be responding to a handful of those, and then we will have a dedicated time in the second portion of the event to respond to the questions and answers with our panelists. So that is hopefully going to go as smoothly as possible. If you'd like to ask a question yourself, as opposed to enter it into the chat feature, you're welcome to raise your hand using the feature that you can find located. If you click on the participant button in Zoom, you'll be able to raise your hand as an option when you see your name in the list. I'll be monitoring all of that as we go through. And so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Maury Nation. Dr. Nation is an associate professor at Vanderbilt's Peabody College and has focused his research on factors that affect youth outcomes, in particular around understanding how community and neighborhood qualities and characteristics promote positive health and positive mental health outcomes. I'm thrilled to have gotten to know Dr. Nation over the last year or so, and I'm really excited about his current research and how we're going to learn from him now. So, Maury, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Just to kind of give you a point of introduction, I mean, this work really started about 6 years ago with many of the people who are serving as panelists and having a conversation about the racial and ethnic disparities in out of school suspension. Next slide. And one of the things that it was really kind of fortuitous that we were able to bring together a partnership between Metro Nashville Public Schools and a group of community members, those who were concerned about discipline and those who are providing various types of supports for young people. And one of the things that came out of that was a really interesting conversation about how we collectively, not just the district, but we collectively as a community have a responsibility to support youth safety and well-being. And we were able to leverage that to identify some funding from the National Institute of Justice. So when I talk about this, you'll hear me talk about it as our work, and it truly is our work, where you see several groups that have contributed to this. Probably most central is our Passage group, which was a group that was formed out of a collaboration with the Annenberg Institute for School Reform, Metro Nashville Public Schools, and our own Tom Ward helped to co-lead some of the local work here. And out of that, one of the things that we figured out was that there's really limited data on the status of young people generally. And this was true for Nashville as well. Next slide. So part of the task for the funding that we received was to pull together a set of data sources that would give us a better picture of this. And one of the things that I often talk about is that schools become the focus of any conversation around safety and well-being, in part because they have the best data. And anybody who's been around schools will immediately say, well, there's so many problems with our data, and there are problems generally with school data. And yet they still, school districts still tend to have the best and most complete data set for measuring school well-being, youth well-being in general in any city. And what we are trying to do was to expand that, to find other ways of capturing how young people were doing in Nashville. What I would say, and you see some of the data sources here on this slide, what I would say to take from this is that this is really trying to pull together what is a unique data set. I mean, there are very few places in the country and none in the Southeast that have been able to pull together data sources, a variety of different data sources that give you just some insight into the types of experiences that young people are having. Next slide. So let me just start with kind of where we started with Passage. And that was really focused on disciplinary inequities. And if you look currently, the rate of inequity is a little over 3-to-1 for Black students. And when I say that, that means that Black students are about 3 times more likely than in this particular case, a comparison of white students, to experience out of school suspension or other kind of exclusionary disciplinary sanctions. Now, one of the things that you'll see in the literature is that there is most of the focus on this research has focused on the school contributors, and what you'll see around the arrows kind of focusing on that inequity are things like explicit and implicit bias. So the potential biases that you might find among teachers, there's also a big focus on disciplinary policy. So one of the things that we know about policies is that things like zero tolerance policies tend to result in more suspensions, and those tend to disproportionately affect students of color. Insufficient social and emotional supports. And again, this is one of those things that districts around the country are really struggling with, is that kids come to school with often carrying a lot of troubles with them. And it's very frequently overwhelms the types of structures and supports that schools have. And one of the outcomes of that tends to be using our disciplinary policies to manage student behavior. And then the last thing I'll mention here is that if if I had to say one thing that explains the disciplinary inequities for it, at least here in Nashville, it is the between school differences. So a lot of times people think about these inequities as, you know, students within a particular school and teachers choosing or behaving toward one group of students differently than another group. What we see in these numbers is really that that is driven primarily by having schools that are mostly serving young people of color, having relatively high suspension rates compared to those that are serving fewer students of color. And so I raise that to say that the interventions might be slightly different if we start to think about what's driving the between school differences as opposed to that which is happening within school. Now, I give this as a foundation because I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make as a community in trying to reduce inequities is that we stop here. And we think, how can we make the school figure out how to not suspend or how to reduce these inequities? And yes, there are some important things that districts can do, but this is only the beginning of the story. And one of the things that I think that we'll be shining a greater light on is some of the other pieces of the story. Next slide. So one of the things that we're seeing is that there are a variety of different types of factors outside of school that are also that we also see the inequities, and we also know that they impact happens in school. And as I said earlier, sadly, we don't have as good a data, and we're hoping to be able to change that. One of those is access to resources. And I think one of the best illustrations of this was when we had the shutdown due to COVID-19. The first question that really kind of ricocheted through our community was not what's the best way to educate young people remotely. It was, will young people have food to eat? And how do we make sure that they are taken care of and safe? That is a fundamental access to resource question that exists parallel to the types of inequities that we're seeing within schools. The second, next slide. So one of the things that we see already from one of our data sources is that as we move around the city, is that students are differentially affected by a variety of different types of resource issues. So one of the things is that one of the greatest resources that we know supports young people's health is having access to an adult who is invested in their well-being. And one of the things that we see over the course of time, number one, is that as students get older, they are less likely to report having that type of relationship. But the other thing is that we see that those types of relationships aren't equally available around different kinds of students, particularly those students who are in areas that are less safe, areas where they have questions about mobility. Those are the types of places where the types of supports that come from an adult would be most important, but they are also the places where students are reporting that they have less access to those things. Next slide. So another type of community contributor is exposure to traumas, and we could spend much of the rest of the afternoon talking about the various types of traumas. What I would say is that I want to highlight a couple of different types. One is those types of kind of direct events. I mean, we see that in the form of ACEs, and there are a whole variety of different types of ACEs that kind of exposures to violence, having a parent taken out of the home. We also see that that young people are differentially exposed to things like gun violence, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a second. And then I'll talk here in just a little bit about the kind of systemic marginalization that also, I think, radiates through their experience as trauma as well. Next slide. So a couple of studies that we have done have really tried to give voice to this. And one was around the issues of firearm availability, and it's really heartbreaking to hear young people talk about their experiences relative to hearing about and witnessing and experiencing violence. One of the data sets that we have already begun analysis with is the Gun Violence Archive. Next slide. And what you see on this, and I know it's hard to see, and we're happy to provide this, is that this is the location of all of the gun violent related events in Nashville since 2018. And what you see is, it's probably not surprising in the sense that there are some places where we see a greater concentration than other parts of the city. And we also know that then results in differential exposure to these types of events. And one of the things there's been an interesting study here just in the last few days from a group at Harvard that have talked about just the presence of something like a police-involved shooting is associated with, if that happens in close proximity to where young people live, that it's associated with lower academic achievement, decreased likelihood of graduation. It's those types of things that we know kind of radiate through the experience of young people, both outside of school, but it has implications for what happens in school. Next slide. One of the things that we've been able to do is to have conversations with young people and to talk about some of the things that are affecting their well-being. And one of the things that comes up repeatedly is the whole issue of gentrification. And I won't read all of this, but just to give you a flavor of it, this particular participant said, they were like, no man, everybody's, they're mean. They don't talk to us, none of that. Kind of just look at us with a face and kind of discriminate us. I don't like that about it because I was alone for most of my life when I was in named a neighborhood. I felt like I had a family, even though they weren't my family. I feel like they're kind of pushing that away. Next slide. The last piece that I'll highlight in terms of community contributors are the systematic marginalization. And what I mean by this is that there are some long-term structural issues that are also they contribute to the exposure to trauma, but they also operate independently and make for young people experiencing fundamentally different types of environments and neighborhoods. And next slide. I think maybe one of the best indicators of this, many of you probably read the study from the Brookings Institution back last year that talked about the zip code 37208 being people who were born in the mid-'80s in that zip code had a higher rate of incarceration than anywhere else in the country. Well, what I'd like for you to do is to think about projecting forward. If those young people had children in their late teens to early 20s, their kids are in metro schools right now. And one of the things that we know is having a parent incarcerated, again, is one of those ACEs. I mean, it's one of those things that has some longer term impacts on development. There is, we also know that policing isn't kind of equitably distributed around the city, and there's several studies that we'll talk about and hopefully be completing that build upon some of the previous work done by folks like Gideon's Army. Next slide. You also see this reflected in, again, some of the conversations that we've had with young people. So again, taking an excerpt from this comment, he says, a lot of police have been stopping people for no reason, out of the blue. There's been a lot more of that. So it's been concerning for a lot of the people in our community, because we're just like, everything's been fine for years, and now then all of a sudden more people start to move in and things start to change, and we don't really like that. This was again a student talking about how as the composition of his neighborhood changed, all of a sudden the place that they had felt was their own no longer felt that way, and in fact they were being surveilled in what they felt was their own neighborhood. Now, the last thing that I'll mention relative to this is that so much of this was done before all of the things that have happened here recently in terms of George Floyd's killing and many of the protests. And I highlight that to say that these are topics that are pressing for young people, have long been pressing for young people, and it's only now that they are starting to gain attention. So next slide. Well, we'll just highlight real quickly are the next steps. I mean, we're just beginning much of this work. What we hope to do is to be able to break down the analysis by neighborhood, so that as over time people can look at the various parts of the city and see about and see some of the unique issues that are affecting young people in their area. What we're also hoping to be able to find are what are the most impactful levers. And what I mean by that is that we know that there are lots of things that can be done that would impact this, but we also know that resources are limited, and we're hoping to be able to find both low-hanging fruit and really strategic levers that can have broad impact on young people's experience. For the city, I think there are some next steps that I think are incredibly important, not the least of which is investment in education. And I'll say just a few things because I know I'm running out of time here, but we have to invest in schools. I mean, and you know, all of the problems that schools face aren't about money, but there are some basic investments that we need to be able to make, and commitments that we need to be able to make to our district.
Sorry. Sorry about that, Maury. There we go.
No problem. And what I would say along with that is that I think within the city, there is this narrative around that the district, especially central office, is bloated, and there's too many, you know, there's money's being wasted and those types of things. And what I would say is I've looked at a lot of districts. I've worked with many of them, and that's just not true. I mean, if for people who think that there is too much being spent in support of the district, I challenge you to spend some time with district personnel or at a local school. And I don't. In many ways, the easy part of this is investing in education. the more difficult part is investing more broadly in our youth. And when I say that, I mean that things like libraries, things like transportation, stable housing are investments in youth. And because we see the inequities similar to those that we talked about with discipline, we see inequities in all of those areas. And I think it comes in the form of our financial commitment, but it also comes in the form of our social commitment. And I know there are several groups that have really made commitments for mentoring and such. And I laud that. I think we're going to need more of that to reduce the types of inequities that we're seeing. And the last thing that I'll mention is that we just have some fundamental questions about equity. One of the things that, if you look at the composition of the district over just since 2015, the district has lost about 10% of its white student population. And why do I raise that? I raise it in part because we have to question, okay, why is that? Is it because people want something different? Or is it because people want something, or are trying to get something better? And, I never begrudge anybody doing something different. But if indeed people are going out and are able to buy something better, then it really reflects on the commitment that we have, again, to our district, and making sure that we provide a high quality education. Otherwise, what we end up with is setting up another structural inequity where people can go out and buy something better. And 15 years from now, we'll be talking about these same disparities, just in different forms. Next slide. With that, I'm over a little bit, but I do want to just acknowledge that this has been the work of lots of different folks, and hopefully it will be just the beginning of a conversation about the types of things that we can do here. Last thing I'll say is that this really is an exciting time in Nashville. I think the district has strong leadership that's up to this challenge. And it's up to us to come around and support the district as it tries to deal with both discipline issues and trying to make Nashville a thriving place for all young people. With that, I like to invite some of my friends and colleagues into this conversation. So we just have a fantastic group. First, I'll introduce Judge Sheila Calloway, my favorite judge, as Lin-Manuel Matthews is prone to say, who is the head juvenile court judge here in Nashville. LaTrya Gordon actually comes to us with some unique experiences in that she is both a graduate of Metro schools, but also now is working within the district as a coordinator, site coordinator for communities in schools. And Dr. Shree Walker, just a fantastic support for young people in her role as the 504 director, is really interfacing with a lot of different systems that are engaging vulnerable young people. And then Tom Ward, who is the president and CEO of the Oasis Center, one of our nonprofits that has been a stalwart in providing support for young people. So with that, I want to start with a question for each of you to address. And you guys have heard some of what I've talked about, and you also have had your own experiences with the types of inequities that exist here in Nashville. So if you would, just take a minute or so to talk about what do you see in your spaces as the kind of manifestations of these inequities and some of the causes of them? Starting with Judge Calloway.
Thank you, Maury, and I always love listening to you. And thank you, Katie, for National Public Education Foundation putting this on. I think it's great. You know, every day I see inequities in the juvenile justice system and the criminal injustice system. I like to say injustice, or not to say, I just say criminal system, period, because there's not a lot of justice for everybody in our systems. When I think about the number of youth that we have right now currently in our juvenile detention facility, the disproportionate amount is out the wall. We literally probably have about 25 youth in here, and maybe only 3 of them are not Black men. And that's always disappointing. I think when I started this job, that was one of the goals that I was going to eradicate myself, is, you know, to make it, you know, more just, make it more even, you know, in fact, take all the kids out of the detention facility if we could. And what I have discovered, it is just so systematically broken on so many levels. And it can't just be me coming in by myself, waving a wand and saying we can get it done. But it takes all of us working together to, first of all, recognize that every one of our systems, when I think about our children that come in that are being abused or neglected, and how even the medical system disproportionately identifies Black kids for the system versus white kids. And white kids, it's more of an accident, whereas Black kids, it's definitely a call to the Department of Children's Services and a referral. And, you know, when you start and look at all of the systems and how they work together, there's so much inequities, and that's why I love the work I do, because I want to be part of the solution in making changes.
Thank you. LaTrya?
Okay. Can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you mind repeating the question, please?
Yeah, just talk about how some of the manifestations of inequities that you've either experienced or see in your work at this point, and some of the causes that you think contribute to it.
Okay. I want to say too, I think your research is phenomenal. I come from a social work background, so like this is right up my alley. I guess in my experience, a lot of the inequalities that I have seen and experienced is the lack of, or I guess like the inequalities in funding. I don't feel like there's a lot of or enough funding that is allocated to education pertaining to, like, you know, after school programs, opportunities for youth to have access to mentors, the disparities in resources. And I think, like, from my personal experience, when I think back being an MNPS graduate, went to Stratford, I think the biggest thing was whenever I went to Belmont, I feel like I was prepared. I didn't know anything, and I didn't know that until I had my first class where I had to write a research paper, 20-page research paper, and I couldn't do that. And so, sorry, I'm a little nervous. I'm gonna be honest.
Don't be, you're doing great.
No worries.
And so I just think, like, if we were to put more investment into the things that you mentioned, especially with investing back with the youth and in education, I think that, Jesus, I'm nervous. I am like fumbling all over myself right now. But I do think that if we put more money into the schools, I do think that in allowing kids to have more access to programs that do give them access to mentors and prepare them for the world, I think it would be a lot different.
Well, thank you. Dr. Walker, can you talk a little bit about this from your perspective?
So I'm a product of Los Angeles Unified School Districts, and I grew up in Watts during the 80s and the 90s, during the Rodney King era, the Watts riots, the crack epidemic, and, you know, being a product of an area that was 2 miles. Watts, that area is like about 2-mile radius with 40,000 people having to endure poverty. And then also being abused at a young age and being born into a family of teenage parents. And so my perspective was shaped by my environment, seeing those inequities, whether it was, just poverty, the housing, the projects, school, lack of funding. My community was just that Black and brown community. And so we really weren't exposed to a lot. And me being a true idealist at heart, but living in reality, the population that I serve, my development like really impacted my perspective now. So it's one of those things where I'm truly advocating for the population and making sure I have the right people around to have those tough conversations, because it's not the inability for them to speak, it's the inability for them to be heard. And those populations are those in juvenile detention centers, foster care, students who have temporary impairments and can't come to school, so they're on homebound services, students who are in residential treatment facilities, Vanderbilt psych, and then also students, some of the students with disabilities. And it's the time that we're living right now mirrors a lot of that back in the 80s or 90s. And like you said, we don't want to be having the same conversation 20 years from now. So what can we do to not just continue to have conversations, but actually let's do the work? And what does that mean moving forward?
Yeah, thank you. Tom, can you weigh in from your experience, both at Oasis and I was remiss not to mention that you've also spent many years at Metro Nashville Public Schools as a principal. So from both of those perspectives. Tom, you're muted.
There we go. How about that? Is that better? Thank you. I'm sorry. That's I think the easiest and most visible answer is availability of resources to neighborhoods. That's, to me, is the easy response, and that seems to be the response we make, and then we never do anything about it. Fundamentally, at a deeper level, what I've noticed over the year is, what do we really believe about our young people? What do we see in them? We start with a punitive attitude that because they're not behaving the way we think they should behave, then that somehow is a deficit, when truthfully, they don't have the opportunity to express their ideas in a very large sense. And there's not an inherent belief that there's value in finding and discovering their gifts and talents and then giving them a chance to explore those. And to me, that's a fundamental piece that we ought to really be talking about. What is it that we want for our children? And what do we want to see them grow up into? And how do we do that? Well, you start with a positive belief that they've got something to offer, and you give them chances to use their voice in leadership roles. And guess what? To make mistakes. And that they're not wrong for making mistakes, they're just learning. And discipline at its heart is about teaching. It's not about punishing, it's about teaching. And that fundamentally is not a conversation we're having. And to me, that's got to be kind of in the hearts and minds of everybody before we really jump into changing policies, because policies without the right value structure make absolutely no difference whatsoever.
Yeah, thank you. And all of you raise just really interesting issues that I'm having to restrain myself from going off script here. Actually, LaTrya, I want to come back to you for a second. Can you talk about, you mentioned your experience as a student. I'm thinking about your experience now as working as kind of in a support role for a school. And do you see changes, and are there some things that you see that you think are really working and that maybe we should be building on?
I feel like, can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So
I started thinking while you were talking instead of listening. I apologize.
No worries. So, I mean, in your role as a support person within communities and schools, are there some things that you see as really working, and some things that you'd like to build on?
Well, I would say, I guess kind of going off what Mr. Ward was talking about, and having the change in our attitude about the way that we think about kids, and changing the way that we approach punishment and mistakes. Just going off of that, I feel like before the communities and schools role was in my school, I guess I kind of felt a little bit hopeless, because like I said, my mindset is social work. And like, that's kind of how I always think about things. I think about like, well, I'm not going to say, okay, this is a bad kid, but like, what is going on at home that contributes to the way that this child acts? Or just the thing that the child does, like, what does this child need to be able to set that student up for success? And so whenever you ask about like, what do I feel like is working and what can we continue to build off, I think like having more programs like Communities and Schools, Community Achieves, and programs that go into the school to help expose kids to the possibilities that they have, and you kind of build on the positive things and expose them to that. I feel like that is more of what we need, rather than saying, okay, well, you did this thing, I'm going to suspend. Because like Mr. Ward was saying, I believe that whenever you are thinking about things that kids do, they are mistakes, and it is about teaching. And I do think if we continue to approach it with punitive punishments and things that kind of don't teach kids, you know, like, well, this is like how you should go about things, I don't feel like we're going down a great path.
Thank you.
That answers your question.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Dr. Walker, can you chime in there in the sense of thinking about what interventions you think that you see are working and that you're hopeful about?
So with all that's going on, we have to be mindful that, you know, students are dealing with anxiety, they're dealing with fears, parents are dealing with the same fears and anxiety. We may have a decrease in students reporting abuse, however, we know that it's not happening. So all these things that are manifesting right in front of our eyes, and we really don't have a handle on it, so to speak. I'm hopeful that everyone is engaging in strategic conversations and in plans on how to support. I think there was a lot of aha moments in the month of March due to the pandemic. If everyone realizing like schools are essential, but like they are essential, and waiting on the school district to make certain decisions on how to support or feed or care for or watch the students. So I'm definitely hopeful for the partnerships and the conversations that individual entities are having to best support each other, and realizing our interconnectedness, and how it's very important that we see people as people first, and how can we support them in whatever their situation or circumstance is at that time.
Thank you. I mean, and my observations were the same, which is that we recognize just how important schools are when we go through a period like we've been through here in the last few months. Mm-hmm. Tom, how about you? Talk a little bit about, I know that you mentioned how we understand young people and is maybe the most important piece of this. But you also mentioned the fact that there's a lot that we know about how to support young people, and yet it doesn't happen. Can you talk a little bit about why you think that is, and ideas about how we move past kind of knowing more to doing more?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you know, for me, the journey through metro schools was quite interesting. I got to work in very challenging schools. I got to work in some of the high-end schools, and got to work with all kinds of families and children. And What I really saw was some structural impediments inside of the way things were designed that were based upon what people felt and thought. So for me, the lesson was pretty significant. What's the difference between providing simple opportunity to young people and giving them genuine access to the things that they need? And those are really big things. They're very big differences. A lot of children who have resources and advocates in their life, when they grow up, they know how to navigate the minimalist barriers that they have in order to get what they need. Lots of other young people who don't have significant advocates and don't have resources readily available for them, they just hit a wall. And so what do? As a city, we just leave them out. We're comfortable with that. And well, that is what that is. And that is absolutely wrong. There's no doubt about that. So when you think back about what it is that we're trying to accomplish, we're trying to give young people a chance to be challenged. I always believed that probably one of the greatest disrespects I could pay another person was to underestimate and make excuses for them and not to challenge them. And we do that to a lot of our children. We do that to a lot of our Black and brown children because we have this implicit bias and this preconceived notion that for some reason they aren't equipped to do it. And nothing could be farther from the truth. And so to me, embedded in schools, if you really look at it in schools, go look at the rosters of AP courses, go look at the rosters of IB classes, go look at the rosters of the most challenging educational programming, and you will find that those children are very underrepresented in those places. And that's a long journey. That didn't just happen on the day of sign up. That happened because all along the way, we didn't push and challenge and provide those resources that made them capable of being in there. And then we create arbitrary rules that keep them out, which is in itself systemic racism because it keeps people in their place. And so one of the things that we challenged, and then I would continue to challenge, is what's most important about like an advanced placement course. Mm-hmm. It's not how many fives that are scored by the kids in the class. Mm-hmm. It's the quality of the journey that you provide for the student in the class. Mm-hmm. And that should be available to all students. Yeah. And if we realize that we didn't do the prerequisite work to get them there, then shame on us. That's what we need to fix. And so we need to go back and look at that. So really it's about looking at the educational system as a collection of individuals. Mm-hmm. And not about what the school's profiles look like. So that's my soapbox. You know that, Maury. But that to me is where we can do the greatest, bring about the greatest amount of change, is when we really begin to look at 98,000 or whatever it is, 85,000 individual students, as opposed to classifying everything about a good school or a bad school. It's about the individuals that we teach.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Judge, building on Tom's response, I mean, one of the things in having this conversation is that it at times feels overwhelming. And I think back to your comment of saying, as an actor in your part of the system, it's so affected by all of the other parts of the system. So I'm going to give you the hard question, Liz. How do we fix this? Where do you see the points of leverage?
The first foremost thing that we have to do as a group and as a community is admit that we have problems. We can hide behind the title, It City, all we want, but when we're not taking care of the thing that makes it, which is our youth and our vulnerable people, then we're not it. And so we've got to stop hiding behind titles and feelings of we're doing everything right, we're progressive, we're on the cutting edge of whatever it is that we think we're doing, and be honest with ourselves. We have deep-rooted racial inequities in all of our systems. And if we're not bold enough to say it, then we're never going to change it. Yeah. And so after we say it and admit it, then we have to do the work. And we have to have these hard conversations. We have to recognize that the racial inequities start everywhere in our system, from housing, from healthcare, from, where you can go get good groceries and good food, from schooling, and all of those things work together. And so I get frustrated when people look at me and say, why is this child committing these horrible crimes? What are you doing about it? And the child is committing these horrible crimes because we as a community gave up and failed that child. We put them in a place where every night when they go to bed, they're hearing gunshots. We put them in a place where we don't know if they're going to get a meal the next day. And then we force them to go into a system that says, you got to come here, you got to sit still, you got to listen to me, you got to pay attention, and if you don't, I'm going to kick you out. And then it kicks you out and says, go home and figure out something to do. And then when you come back, catch up. Because if you can't catch up, we're going to kick you out again. And then when they kicked out again, then they come to me and they've done something serious because they got nothing else to do. And until we recognize how all of that plays a part in the health, wealth, and the well-being of our children, and are willing to make the hard changes, willing to change how we do our business, we've got to make changes. And if we can't do it, we'll end up in the same status quo that we're in now.
Yeah. That's a fantastic summary. I mean, one of the things that I often wonder is if I could kind of flash up in the way that I did the disciplinary inequities, say the inequities around housing security or the inequities around food insecurity. I mean, I bet those numbers would be actually much worse than the discipline inequities. And I think we've got to hold ourselves as accountable to those things as we do to reducing the disciplinary inequities, because they all work, they all feed one another. I know, Katie, I've gone way over, so I will turn it over to you.
It was a fantastic discussion by our panelists, and we have had a ton of really compelling questions posed in the chat. So I'm going to just call on a couple panelists to respond to a few of these, also recognizing that Maury, Dr. Nation, some of the questions were directly specific about your research, and so I'm going to ask, he has volunteered to stay on after 5 o'clock for those questions that are specific to his research, if you would like to have those answered. One that I found particularly that was repeated quite a bit, and I would love it if Dr. Walker could hit on this one first, is how best we as a community can support our young people right now with schools in this flux of reopening. And if schools are not in session in the fall, what can we do as a community to show our support for students in our system? Would you like to take that one, Dr. Walker?
Yes, thank you. I would say collaboration is definitely needed. I think we as entities often work in silos and we make assumptions because we don't know how each entity works. So if there are community partners or parents or volunteers that want to get connected with schools, I would say find your community school, reach out to the principal, connect with partners such as Community Chiefs, which is Allison MacArthur's office. Stay connected on Facebook and look at the messages that Dr. Battle is putting out there, and just reach out and just say, here we are ready to serve, but also come up with ways that they can help, because we are still trying to figure out things and there may be some gaps. How can you help with delivering food or resources and even supplies for parents who may have shortages in household items or food, or educating students in a different realm, because we're still figuring out what that's going to look like. But just being able to connect with the community, the schools in your community, and engaging in conversation and being willing to serve.
That's great.
Katie, I just wanted to add real quick. I mean, I hope that we approach this fall as an all hands on deck, I mean, for the district. I mean, because we know that even in the typical year, over the course of a summer, there is slide and there's adjustment when young people come back. Well, we've had 2 summers, along with all kinds of plagues and disruptions that have happened over the course of those times. So we all should be prepared for kids who are going to need us, whether we are teachers, whether we are principals, or whether we are just concerned citizens. They're going to need us. So I hope that everybody is looking for ways to figure out how to support young people as school starts back up.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a great point, and a lot of people touched on it in the questions as well. I'm just going to ask this question of Tom, given his perspective as both a principal and someone who works with our youth every day. Isn't the disruption that we're currently seeing in our schools an opportunity to make dramatic changes in education and remake schools in a way that drive equity instead of the current system, which drives inequity? Could you talk to that, Tom?
Yeah, and I've always believed that within any kind of crisis that you have, there's a bigger opportunity if we just choose to look for it. So it's that's a great place to begin. When we start handing out digital devices, that's a beginning simple point. But when we go in and we check with the families to see what they need, and then we try to do more than just simply hand out a device for educational resources. We hand it out and we teach the family how that opens up the world for them. I love the fact that we talked about healthcare and housing and all those other areas, because the three levers, when we work with a young person who's experiencing homelessness at Oasis, we look at it through three lenses. What's their educational degree? What does secure housing look like for them if they have every opportunity for that? And do they have a source of income? So it's about getting trained, getting a job, and then having a secure place to live. And you create that foundation for folks. It's a springboard of a place to take them to greater heights and self-sufficiency. So to me, there's a chance to really get to know our families right now, really get to know what the challenges are. And the other thing that I would add to that, Katie, is it's also for us as a community to realize that we can't build the solutions to these problems on the backs of schools. There's a core mission that schools have. Everything that happens in our community shows up there every day. That's the only place that it shows up. And so we have to step up and say to schools, we're not only going to just partner with you, but we're going to take responsibility for providing the things that you shouldn't be asked to provide. And what we want them to do is be interventionists with us. Not punishers, but interventionists with us as we intervene in the lives of families and kids.
Thank you, Tom. LaTrya, I'm going to ask a question that came up on a couple of different feeds around how you feel about, whether you think that racial bias and microaggression is an issue with our educators and with the communities and schools work that you see in our schools every day. Are you seeing the racial biases play out on a significant basis? And if so, do you have thoughts on how we can address implicit bias in our educators and focus on microaggressive behavior? I think LaTrya is still on mute.
I said, I do. My answer to that question is yes. And I feel like in my experience, I feel like the way that we start to address that is, I think, basically just by experience and talking to people. Whenever you talk to people, you learn about, what they've been through. I think when you prejudge someone based off, their actions or how they appear, I think, it's kind of, I guess I can kind of understand, why people might have their biases. However, I think if you dig a little bit deeper and you get to the point to where you are seeking to understand for the betterment of, the students and the family, I think from there, I think that's kind of how you do it. I guess in my experience, that's how it was. And I think too, what Mr. Tom was just saying about this idea of teaching the whole family. I think, if you think about it, there's the daddies and the mamas, it's basically, they have their own trauma, and I think it kind of trickles down. And so, whenever you look into, what exactly is going on, I think you can kind of understand people a little bit better.
That's great. Thank you so much. And then I'm going to ask one final question of Judge Calloway and then wrap up our conversation today. And this is a simple one for you, Judge Calloway. How do you think about reparations as an essential public policy to address inequity? And are we ready as a community to have those conversations? If we're not ready, what will it take to have a conversation around reparations in Nashville?
So I did see that question go through the chat, and I said, ooh, I hope I don't have to answer that one. So, I definitely think reparations would help. And, the part of the reparations that helps is the admittance of the longstanding systematic racism that this country was founded upon. And until our community is ready to acknowledge that that is an issue and that we want to heal from that, then we cannot move forward. And so, I am a big proponent of restorative justice and a big proponent of making sure that we are coming together to heal one another. I think we can get there. I think if we keep talking to one another and keep talking about how particularly our youth are hurting, then we can come together and say, we understand your hurt. We understand the lifelong hurtness that has happened in our nation, and we're ready to start healing. And one of the things that starts healing is to put people on a footing where they can be a part of our society and be successful. We cannot expect people to, I think Avi said this earlier on one of his posts, is we can't expect people to, pull themselves on their bootstraps if we've never afforded them an opportunity to even buy a boot. And, we've got to do what we can to change the system, to change the way we treat one another. Reparations, healing is super, super important. And I definitely think that it's something we can reach.
Well, that was a wonderful ending, and I just want to thank our fantastic panelists and Dr. Nation, and your presentation is so helpful. We want to close with a couple of comments on things that we just want to pose, and some of these have already come up on the call. Ways that you can actually help further this conversation in your own networks and your own communities. As I think Dr. Walker mentioned, I would challenge every person on this call to find out who your local principal is in your neighborhood and call them up and say, I know that this is a hard time. What can I do to help you and your students? I thought that was a fantastic point that Dr. Walker made, and we really advocate for that involvement, whether you have kids in the system or not. There are lots of opportunities to have small conversations in places of work, and could you possibly organize or sponsor one of those in your own community? And then is there a way that you could sponsor internships, mentoring opportunities for students of color in our system, in our district, in your organization and in your networks? And then finally, we would be remiss as the Nashville Public Education Foundation to not just really encourage everyone to get engaged and involved in our school board elections. We have elections coming up on August 6th. And we have 5 seats right now out of our 9 seats on the board that are up for this cycle. So 3 in contested races. So please learn about the candidates and find out more about our school board. Local elections are incredibly important, and we really encourage everyone to vote and participate as much as possible. With that, I've held you over a tiny bit, but I really appreciate your time. Again, a huge thank you to Dr. Nation and to all of our panelists, Tom, LaTrya, Judge, and Dr. Walker. We really appreciate your time, and please feel free to stay on if you'd like to have some specific questions with Maury. So with that, I think we're adjourned. Thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate your involvement.